Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Matthew Goldstein, who's the Chief Executive Officer of jscreen. If you're not familiar with it already, it's a national nonprofit that's been dedicated to making genetic screening accessible, affordable, and easy to use. It was originally the brainchild, I think, of academics at Emory, and it was really a public health program, right? But then you all reimagined it in 2024. We're going to get into the origin story there and talk about what you're doing today, but also you have a fascinating career. You've been in biotech incubation, you've done an MD, PhD, so I'm excited to just give the audience a little bit of chance to get to know you as well as jscreen. So thank you for taking the time to join us.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to be here, Patrick, and thanks for the opportunity.
Let's start at maybe early in your career. We were actually just before we started recording talking about California, and I think you grew up there. You went to Stanford, did an MD, PhD. What were you focusing on at the time? If you could take us back to the kinds of questions that were interesting to you at the time.
Yeah, so as you said, I grew up in California and have been in Boston for the last 15 years. And was fortunate enough to go to Stanford and do my MD, PhD. My graduate work was in the lab of a guy named Ron Levy, and Ron Levy had focused on developing personalized therapy for hematologic malignancies, so lymphomas, leukemias, and really became famous for his work in developing what was called anti-idiotype therapy. So in B-cell lymphoma in particular, B cells make antibodies. Each B cell makes a unique antibody that is different from every other B cell. And when you have a lymphoma that arises, a tumor that arises out of a single B cell, that tumor is clonal, meaning that every cell in that tumor expresses that specific unique antibody, and that becomes in some ways maybe the best tumor specific marker or tumor specific target. And what Ron identified and realized was that you could then develop a custom antibody for each individual person that was targeted against that specific target, and they called that an idiotype ID, as sort of the moniker for that therapy, and the therapy became known as anti-idiotype therapy. And so Ron actually developed and treated the first patient at Stanford, making the therapy in his lab, and it was just an incredible example of bench to bedside work. And when I was a first year medical student, Ron came and gave a lecture to us in medical school and told this story of this first patient. And I was just hooked. I thought it was the coolest thing. And so I walked down the hall actually that afternoon and said, "Hey, I'd like to join your lab." And he said, "Well, what can you do?" He said, why should I have you in the lab?" So,
do you remember what you said that convinced him?
I will say I was caught off guard. I think I said something to the effect of like, I'm gonna like work my tail off for you, and I'm a quick study, and
yes.
I said
you don't have to pay me very much.
Yeah, exactly. I said enough that he was gracious enough to welcome me in. But when I was there, what I ultimately ended up studying was cancer vaccines and personalized cancer vaccines. So instead of creating therapies from immune components like cell-based therapy or antibody-based therapy and dosing that to an individual. The concept was, can we create some sort of immune stimulating entity, some sort of vaccine that can be custom to an individual and raise their own endogenous immune response against the tumor. And so that was what I studied in graduate school, and ultimately was really hoping to be just like Ron, open a lab and see patients and teach, and they call that the triple threat. So that was the plan, and I had an amazing time at Stanford, and really that was where I got some of my first exposure to genetics and genomics. When I was in medical school was like really the era when 23andMe was starting to make genetics and genomics a household name.
Yeah.
A household concept, and we were obviously on the cancer vaccine side thinking a lot about the genomic profiles of tumors as ways to identify novel targets within a tumor that could be used for vaccines or for targeted therapy. And then I left Stanford and then left the West Coast against better judgment for those who like the West Coast weather. And came to Boston for residency in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And as I said, the plan was to go do an oncology fellowship and be a professor. But I ended up getting introduced to Bob Tepper, who was one of the founding partners at a company building venture capital firm called Third Rock Ventures here in Boston. And they were super interested in building a cancer vaccine company. They were working with Eric Lander at the Broad and Kathy Wu and Nir Cohen, and a handful of other folks. And Bob was sort of gracious enough to ask if I wanted to get involved in helping them to kick the tires on that concept. So instead of moonlighting at the VA, I moonlit with Third Rock and ultimately ended up helping to build and launch and was on the founding team for what became Neon Therapeutics, which was a personalized cancer vaccine company. It was really taking what I was doing in graduate school, which was so basic relative to what we were doing at Neon. But we were creating personalized cancer vaccines based on the unique neoantigen profile of an individual's tumor. So taking a tumor biopsy, sequencing the genome of that tumor, identifying all of the variants, the mutations that were unique in that tumor as compared to the person's germline, running that mutational profile through an algorithm to determine which of those variants would lead to proteins that were immunogenic or could be recognized by the immune system as foreign, and then creating we actually pursued a peptide-based vaccine to stimulate an immune response against that individual's tumor. And really just such a cool and sort of futuristic technology at the time. And we ultimately launched several clinical trials in solid tumors in combination with an immunotherapeutic drug called anti-PD-1. And we got some great responses, and that work sort of launched me into biotech and biotech company creation.
Yeah, and I think Neon lives on now through they were acquired by BioNTech, right? The
Correct.
famous and household name due to the COVID vaccines, but also working
Correct.
still today on cancer vaccines as well. So
correct. Yeah, and it was cool. But BioNTech was our competitor in this space. They were pursuing very similar approach, but using an mRNA platform as opposed to a peptide platform. And obviously the infrastructure and the capability that they built around that mRNA platform allowed them to pivot so rapidly to develop the COVID vaccine, which was just incredible positioning at the time. So Neon ended up getting acquired by BioNTech, and they've done some fantastic work advancing the vaccine technology. So great for patients overall.
Yeah, I mean, you've done an amazing looking back at your CV while I was prepping for this, you just got you managed to, I think, double up on some really interesting things. You were in residency and founding a biotech at the same time. So you've been living that triple threat, and I'm curious to understand the transition from that work you were doing to now you're CEO of jscreen. I know there's a really interesting and personally impactful story as well behind what motivates you to do what you do. So it'd be great if you could tell that to the audience and talk a little bit about how it relates to the purpose of jscreen and what drives you today.
Yeah, of course, of course. Um, Along the way in that journey through residency and medical school residency and ultimately into biotech, I met and married a beautiful woman from outside of Philadelphia. And she's also Jewish by background, and we decided to start a family. And as we sort of learn in the Jewish community, reproductive carrier screening is something you almost like learn it in Hebrew school in some
Really?
ways.
Yeah.
And so, because of the increased risk of inherited disease in the Jewish population, and so we both had reproductive carrier screening done here in Boston prior to starting a family. My wife was reported as a carrier for a couple of diseases, Tay-Sachs and another disease called SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. And my report came back that I was not. So we proceeded to start a family, and Myra got pregnant and actually gave birth to our first daughter, Javi. She was born on our wedding anniversary in 2018, 2 years to the day. The best anniversary gift you can imagine.
That is very sweet.
She changed our life, in that moment, as any parent knows. It's just the most remarkable thing. And she was beautiful and strong and developed normally for about a year. We were first-time parents, so it was hard to know really what the developmental arc was supposed to look like. And at her 1 year appointment, she was delayed on a few milestones, and we got a diagnosis from the pediatrician of developmental delay, and it sent us down this path of occupational therapy and early intervention, and ultimately seeing a whole slew of specialists. And over the next few months, Javi didn't make much progress. Like, she was, if anything, maybe she was getting weaker and getting further away. And we initially, shortly after Thanksgiving, got a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, which was devastating at the time and very confusing because the pregnancy and the birth were all normal. And that ultimately landed us in a neurogeneticist office at Boston Children's a few weeks later. And on December 17th, 2019, Javi was about 15 months old. We got the truly devastating and really like life-shattering diagnosis that she had Tay-Sachs disease, which is, obviously a fatal, incurable, devastating neurodegenerative disease. And we were shocked because we had both gotten carrier screened, and that's one of the diseases that is sort of really the paradigm for why carrier screening is important. And in fact, Myra was 11 weeks pregnant with our second. Wow. And so the next day we were in high risk OB. She got a chorionic villus sampling, which is like a procedure like an amniocentesis to test the fetus. And Kaya, who is our second daughter, is a carrier. She overlapped with Javi for about 6 months. And so from the time of Javi's diagnosis in December, we had her for 13 months. She slowly lost everything, the ability to eat, to chew, to see, to speak. And then ultimately she died in my wife's arms, in our bed at home, on January 20th of 2021, and turned our world upside down. I absolutely sort of shattered everything that we thought we thought and we had hoped and we had expected would be our path. And in digging into like how this could have happened, we learned obviously that I in fact am a carrier. and that the physician who ordered my test ordered the wrong test and misreported my carrier status. Which, seems like inconceivable in this day and age, and especially in a city like Boston. And medical errors happen, and obviously many of them are like never ever events, and it's the like unfortunate set of circumstances that arise for those to occur. But this is one that I really think is actually a never ever event, and is something that, as I started to explore this more, made just abundantly clear to me that while we have this incredible capability in genetics and genomics, and have advanced the field in remarkable ways since the sequencing of the human genome back in 2000, that we just don't use it in medicine, and the gap between what we can do and what we actually do is enormous. And there's many reasons for that, lack of knowledge, lack of education, lack of infrastructure, issues with billing, complexity around what the testing is, what it does, how to interpret it, how to implement it. So there are myriad reasons why that's the case. But I would argue that it is one of the most powerful tools we have in medicine. Like, what we can do with genetics and genomics to inform prevention and early diagnosis, like this is the maybe second to vaccines, that this is the most powerful intervention on health that we have. And the fact that we don't use it really at all is it's a travesty. And that realization and that exploration is ultimately what led me to jscreen, which, as you said, started in many years ago in 2013, initially as an academic effort out of Emory, and then was sort of supported and launched by Bernie Marcus and the Marcus Family Foundation. Bernie was the co-founder of Home Depot, and the idea that they had was to create a national telegenetics organization to support education, access, and interpretation of results for individuals around the country, and to do that in a way that people could get tested at home, that they could get on the phone and talk to a genetic counselor, and really make it super, super easy. Which, at the time, 2013, that was like way ahead of the curve.
Yes.
And so when I learned about jscreen and what they had been doing, I said, how come I didn't know about this? Like, how come my physician didn't know about this? Like, Avi would still be here. And they said, look, it's been hard to grow, and there are lots of challenges. And so I started informally advising them for about a year. Ultimately, that led to a conversation with Bernie Marcus down in Atlanta, and he said, look, like, I think you've got great ideas and a great background to help transform this organization. I'll give you a 2-year grant to see if you can sort of put it on a new path, but you have to come down and lead this thing full time. So I was at a small venture creation studio with a couple of buddies, and I called them the next day and said, I'm going to go do this thing. And a month later, I was full time with jscreen.
I mean, that is it's a heartbreaking story. It's also, I think, an amazing testament to it. I've been somewhere similar to where you have. I think you may know I lost my daughter in 2022, and it puts you in a very dark place. But I'd honestly describe it as like a life-changing pep talk from one of the doctors that said to us at the time, it's fully your right to let this like destroy you and never want to think about it, talk about it again. But you can also choose, once you process the grief, to try to channel it for some kind of good. And I can see that you've done that in a tremendous way, right? One of the best ways you can honor her is to try to help other families, right, that may be able to avoid the issue that you had. So I think it's amazing. Do you feel like, did you have that kind of moment at any time where somebody talked to you, or you just came to that realization yourself that you said, like, I want to try to do something specific here, or was
Mm,
this like a lightning strike moment where you were talking to the jscreen people and it kind of came together?
yeah, that's a beautiful question. And um, yeah, being in this club of bereaved parents, with you is the club that you never want to be in,
Yeah,
and at the same time, it is a group of people who, because of what we have gone through, are forced to like look at the world through a different lens. And I think, through in many ways like a richer lens. I would give it all back for like 30 seconds to hold Hav. And I would go back to the old life. But I think what we learned in the experience of her life and death and the aftermath, and trying to make some sense of it, is that like we're on this world for like such a short period of time, obviously. And I think from a professional perspective, like I always felt a draw to, or a drive to work on something that had like deep meaning for
yeah,
me. And this is the ultimate
yes,
vocation that blends my personal experience and my professional experience. And it almost became like very obvious very quickly after I started talking to jscreen, that this was maybe like why I was put here to do this
yeah,
work. And I think what has really been beautiful that I didn't appreciate at the time is that this is also a way for me to be Hav's dad in in um, in a way that like allows me to talk about her,
yeah,
to keep her present in my life, to like put her out in the world. And I don't get to do that in the like typical traditional way. And selfishly, I'm really grateful for that. Like
yes,
it's painful, but it's also very beautiful that I get to talk about her every day and tell her story and talk about who she was and how she impacted me and our family. And our Slack channel at jscreen is called Javi Gear. And
it's
it's
amazing.
it's it's really cool. And I'm very grateful for that.
That is amazing. I want to get your perspective on how especially carrier screening and preventive screening more generally can live up to the potential that you talked about before, which I very much agree with. What's the state of play today as you see it, and then where do you think the big opportunities are?
Yeah. I mean, scientifically and technologically, we are in an incredible place. I
Yeah,
mean, the the reality that we can sequence an entire genome in hours, that we can do that for hundreds of dollars, low hundreds of dollars. The analysis, the ability to analyze that data robustly and quickly is advancing at exponential speed, especially with the advent of AI. And we're starting to move even beyond the monogenic diseases, which, that's the low hanging fruit and the stuff that should be available for everyone everywhere. But we're starting to move into really fantastic and fascinating areas of polygenic risk scores, that are profoundly impactful for diseases like diabetes and autism spectrum disorder, and many others. So, where we are today in this like very basic utilization of carrier screening, to a lesser extent hereditary cancer screening, to a lesser extent hereditary cardiovascular disease screening, compared to where we can be even today if we just rolled out everything that's available, but where we will be in the coming years, across many other disease
yeah,
areas. I think we're like it feels like we're right on the cusp of just a major explosion. The biggest challenge is the gap of like awareness and implementation. It's really like it's an implementation issue as opposed to a technological issue. And I think that is in some ways why I think what jscreen has built and what we're aspiring to do is so important, because it closes that implementation gap. It solves that implementation gap. It's not super sexy new technology, new fancy sequencer, or, some incredible program to interpret variants more rapidly. It's like just sort of that basic, how do you take this really cool science, this super powerful medical intervention, and how do you make that easy for an individual, a family, a doctor, a health system to actually use? That's the biggest challenge I see for the field.
You're on the board of Genomes to People, I think, and we've had Robert Greene on the podcast previously. And one of the things we talked about with him was exactly this: that one of the major barriers to genetics adoption is just how we pay for testing, right? It's this test that can give you value across cardiology, neurology, family planning. It touches almost every aspect of the health system, but we don't really see or measure the value quite yet in that way. And doubly so when it's even public health related upstream screening. How do you think about tackling these challenges? Because I think people can order testing directly from jscreen, right, through an insurance pay or self-pay. And it looks like it's you're a nonprofit organization, so you're offering it at a very reasonable price. I guess you're probably also working with health systems to implement broader scale programs. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you're tackling that problem.
Yeah. No, the payment problem is, it's not obviously only a problem and a challenge for us. I think, unfortunately, like, the business model for insurance is to not pay for testing, not pay for services. And so there's that inherently is a problem in the way it's set up. And I think when you look at screening type testing in particular, the benefit of those dollars is not accrued for a long period of time. And in many cases, the output of those dollars will often actually lead in the short term to increased expenditure. Right. So if you identify an individual who is a BRCA carrier, and the day before they didn't know that, and the day after they do know that, and now they're getting a breast MRI or a mammogram every 6 months, or they decide to have prophylactic surgery to remove their breasts or their ovaries or their uterus, you're now actually increasing the amount of spend in the short term. So that is, I think that is one of the reasons why there is pushback from the insurance side of things. I think it actually leads me to a really important realization, and I think an important value proposition for jscreen, that this type of testing may not actually be best served by the for-profit side of our industry. That it may be that this is much better served as a nonprofit where patients are the only shareholder. Because if we don't have to answer to Wall Street, if we don't have to answer to investors, where we are constantly trying to maintain margin and increase margin and grow the business, that puts a series of constraints and pressures on what you do that are not going to support doing the kind of testing that we're doing. And we've seen that play out commercially. Like, the reimbursement for expanded carrier screening is very bad, generally speaking. And many of the commercial labs have dropped expanded carrier screening because it's not good business.
Right.
That's horrible. That's not the reason to drop testing, to not do testing that we know has profound implications and can save lives. Like, doesn't make any sense. So I think setting jscreen up as a nonprofit, ensuring that patients are our only shareholders, and making sure that we can use philanthropic dollars to support, subsidize, ensure access to testing for anyone who wants it. That is ultimately, I think, critical to advance the field and really distinguishing for jscreen as compared to others that are out there. We also need to figure out how to build the organization in a way that is sustainable so that we're not entirely reliant on philanthropy, because then that becomes a limit on how many people we can serve. And that's one of our challenges. That's, I think, ultimately one of the things that Bernie set out. One of the charges he sort of set out for me to try and accomplish was, how do you build this into more of a sustainable organization?
Yeah, that's amazing. I really like that, and it leads me to one of my questions about what you're hearing from philanthropists. Like, what are the sorts of things that because there's a market failure in some ways here, right? Where, especially in the U.S., I don't think anybody would argue that the incentives in the system are perfectly set up, and so there's a lot of opportunity to remold that in some way. And when you have an opportunity for philanthropists to go and say, you know what, the business isn't figuring this out right now, and it really needs to happen. What are the key things that you're hearing and that you think you can do?
Yeah, I think I'm like learning. I would say I'm relatively new to the philanthropic space and to raising money in the philanthropic space, which is different than fundraising in the for-profit space.
Yes.
And has its own set of like unique characteristics and challenges. I think ultimately, like one thing I'm seeing and hearing in terms of feedback is that generally philanthropists don't like to cover, or at least there's not a lot of excitement around covering operational costs. Covering like the day-to-day of keeping the lights on, which is actually the most important thing in many ways. There's a lot of excitement about funding, new projects or new initiatives, or, a new building or some new infrastructure. That's it's sexy and it's cool and it's tangible. You can like put your hands on it. You can walk in the doors with, the name of the new center underneath it. But keeping the lights on and hiring great people and keeping them supported and stimulated and educated, that is like such a critical part of this work. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're working very hard to figure out how we can support the organization operationally from an earned revenue perspective. I think one other comment I'll make on the sort of philanthropic side, and I think there's some work for us to do educationally in this way, is that, and I think that this may be specific to the Jewish community, but I think is general, more generally, is also a phenomenon more generally, which is that I don't think that people really understand how much capability we have in genetics and how little we are using it. I think there is an assumption that we've sort of like we've done this, we've sort of solved this already, and that genetics is not going to that it doesn't there's not untapped potential there in many ways. And I think Tay-Sachs is a great example where the Jewish community did amazing work in and around Tay-Sachs between 1970 and the mid 1990s. 1970 was when the enzyme was discovered, and the first screening event, which was blood-based testing for actual enzyme. It was an enzyme function test, essentially. 1970 was when the first screening event was run. And the Jewish community like rolled this out and promoted this. And between 1970 and mid 90s, the rate of Tay-Sachs in the Jewish community went down by over 95%, which is remarkable. That's like
Yes.
you've almost eliminated a disease from the community through that. And I think that led to a sort of belief that like, oh, we've solved this, like we checked this box, you know. And I think in many ways it sort of got passed over to the medical community at that point. And that was simultaneously when we sort of saw the like genomics genetics revolution really launch, and the baton got dropped. And I think we've not, like, the medical community has not picked up that responsibility and driven it forward with the same passion and intensity and commitment and rigor that, you know, from what we saw in the Jewish community over that 25-year period. And there are a lot of people that I talk to that they're like, wait, Tay-Sachs? Like, your daughter died of Tay-Sachs? I thought we were done with that. Like, what do you mean? Like, oh, we can screen for hundreds of diseases? Like, what? I didn't know that. So I think we got a lot of work to do on the education side.
Yeah, and I think I want to get your perspective on what we can learn from the success in the Jewish community with Tay-Sachs and other conditions to apply to carrier screening more broadly, because I think the research suggests that it is, you know, probably around a 1%, maybe 2% hit rate with a couple that you find something significant with carrier screening, right? You'll know the numbers better than me, but it's non-trivial, like especially given the dropping costs and the profound impact that it can have when you find something. And I wonder if you made a really interesting point about, you started to learn about it in Hebrew school, and like there's no taboo about it. It's part of the DNA of the community. And what do you think we could learn about making this just a little bit more of a real thing that is within the lifeblood of the healthcare system versus like, oh, I didn't realize you could do that, and basically nobody does it. It's really very rare that anyone would do it.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful question. I think the majority of carrier screening that's done right now, I think it's like over 85%, is done once individuals are already pregnant. So the typical way it happens is that a woman will miss her period, do a pregnancy test, find out she's pregnant, schedule an appointment with an OBGYN, and show up. Usually it's 8 weeks is the first OBGYN visit. And it's usually at that 8-week visit that the individual there'll be a bunch of tests that are run, one of which is a very small carrier screening panel at that point. That test takes a few weeks to come back. So now the woman is 10 weeks or 12 weeks. If she is a carrier for diseases of concern, they then have to go test the partner. So then the partner has to go get a test. That can take a few weeks. You can see where this is going, that you may not actually find out that you're a carrier couple until a woman is like 14, 15, 16 weeks pregnant. And then you have to make a decision whether you want to test the fetus or not. And that timeline makes no sense. We should be doing carrier screening preconception, which is the numbers, the historical numbers for jscreen. Over 90% of people who use jscreen for carrier testing do it preconception. It's completely flipped from what we see in the general healthcare system. And I think the historical experience in the Jewish community, what it speaks to is that I think preventive health is really community health. The healthcare system, the medical system that we have in the United States, it's not a healthcare system, it's a disease care system. You go to it when you have a problem. Once there is something wrong, once you are pregnant. It's not, we don't do prevention in the healthcare system. We talk about it a lot, but we actually don't do it at all. And so I think the lesson and really the playbook that we at jscreen have put to work is that community-based playbook. It's when a rabbi says to a couple who's getting married, hey, I'm not going to marry you unless you do jscreen, because these diseases are real for our community and for our population. It's really important. We want you to have a healthy family and healthy kids. It's when a a community member whose mother just died of breast cancer says to his or her friends, hey, my mom just died of breast cancer at 58. Like, we got to go get screened, man.
Go get tested.
We got to go do this because it can save your life. I think those are the moments where, and these are scary things like this, the results that come back from this they're real. They have real impacts, and you need people around you to support you when you get that kind of information and you have to make decisions about what to do with it. You need people to pick you up from the hospital after you've had your mastectomy and sit with you during the period of time that you're healing. So you need that community around you. And I think that is really where preventive health is community health, and leveraging that as the channel to make this something that people are aware of and educated about, and comfortable doing. I think that we see it time and time again through events and personal stories of like how people come to this work.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more with that perspective. I think it's a great way to think about it, and it's a good call to action for us to think about how we don't just complain about the incentives in the healthcare system and how to fix them, but you're thinking differently, right? There's other ways we can influence that problem, and I think it's really spot on. If people want to learn more, I know they can go to jscreen.org. There's an opportunity you can donate. You can check out the test, see if it makes sense for you. What else can people do to help, or is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we close out?
No, I mean, I think you hit on the two key points there. Obviously, going to the website and educating yourself and your family about this technology and the capability is really the most important thing. And obviously, listen to the podcast.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, everybody tune in for more great guests like Matt. We appreciate you taking the time, and like I said earlier in the episode, it is just profoundly moving I speak to patient advocates and people like you that have picked themselves up from these devastating events in their lives and figured out a way to channel it into something that makes a difference for other people. So thank you for taking this chapter of your life and focusing it on this.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you everybody as always for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks as always for tuning into the Genetics Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, the best way you can support the show is by sharing it with a friend or colleague who might find it interesting as well. We'd also really appreciate if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps other people discover the show when they're searching for content on genetics, precision medicine, or biotech. We always want to hear from you as well. If you have feedback or questions or want to be featured on the show, you can email us at podcast@sonogenetics.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Patrick Short. You can find us as well, Sonogenetics, on LinkedIn, or reach out on Instagram at The Genetics Podcast. And finally, a special thank you to the team behind the show who makes this possible. Joy Ismail produces and manages the show. Jane Reddy Webster keeps us organized, and James Pierce from Selective Frequencies for his expert audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.